everyone, and welcome to our panel on thinking about religion, how religion can increase racial and gender diversity in science. I'm Jackie Frost, a postdoctoral research fellow at Rice University with the Religion and Public Life program, and I'll be moderating the panel today. So for the first 15 minutes of the panel, our presenters are going to provide brief 5-minute recaps of the data that they presented in their spotlight videos. Brandon Vaidyanathan will start by introducing the larger project that all of the panelists will be presenting from today, which is the Religion Among Scientists in International Context Study, the largest international study of scientists' attitudes towards religion, gender, and ethics ever undertaken. Then David Johnson will discuss their findings regarding the varieties of atheism in science and whether science has a marketing problem. And finally, Elaine Howard-Eklund will discuss findings regarding how religion is a missing dimension in gender and racial diversity in science. After the panelists recap their findings, the respondents will each get 2 minutes to summarize their responses and pose questions to the panelists. Our respondents for today are Moramai Lopez-Alonzo, Sei Kim, and Georgia Dunstan. Then we'll open it up for discussion for the remainder of the session, and the panelists will respond to the respondents' comments as well as take questions from the online audience. So please be putting your questions into this panel's Slido link throughout the presentations, and I will be sure to pose them to the panelists during the Q&A at the end of the panel. So to get us started, I'll turn it over to Brandon to kick us off.
Great, thank you, Jackie. Could everyone see my slides here? Assuming this is sharing, so.
Yes.
Great, okay. Hi, I am Brandon Vaidyanathan, Associate Professor and Chair of Sociology at the Catholic University of America. And I'm just gonna give you an overview of the Religion Among Scientists in International Context study. You've probably seen this already. This is the findings that are summarized in our book, Secularity and Science. I'll give you a quick recap of the main findings. So just to give you a sense of our data and methodology, we looked at 8 international contexts, that is France, Hong Kong, India, Italy, Taiwan, Turkey, the UK, and the US, and focused on 2 disciplines, biology and physics, and surveyed more than 22,000 scientists, of whom 9,422 responded to our survey. And then we conducted in-depth interviews with more than 600 of them. And so our first big finding is that there are more religious scientists than we are led to believe. And so in these different countries in our sample, we can see that the religiosity of scientists, that is the percentage of scientists who consider themselves to be religious persons, varies considerably from 16% of scientists in France to 59% of scientists in India. And then the differences between scientists and the general population in religiosity also varies. And you can see certainly in Western Europe, the population of scientists is much less religious than the general public, whereas those differences are not as pronounced in other countries. And the other interesting thing is that in some countries, like some contexts like Hong Kong and Taiwan, we found scientists to be more religious than the general public. Our second big finding is that science comes up in many ways in the scientific workplace, or religion comes up in many ways in the scientific workplace. And this happens through immigration, it happens through interaction with religious publics, and it happens through culture. And a good example of the cultural overlap of science and religion is in the context of India, where in many ways through religious ceremonies on scientific campuses or religious idols and religious festivals and so on, science and religion tend to overlap in scientific organizations. And finally, most scientists we find do not see science and religion as conflicting. In fact, the majority of scientists in all of the contexts in our study see science and religion as being primarily in a relationship of independence. That is, they see science and religion as referring to different aspects of reality. For a substantial minority in some contexts like Hong Kong, India, Taiwan, and Turkey, we see the second dominant position as being collaboration rather than conflict. And so just to recap, there are more religious scientists around the world than we might think. Science and religion seem to overlap in many ways in scientific work. And this conflict idea of science and religion seems to be predominantly a Western phenomenon. And so we really need to put the conflict myth to rest, this idea that there's an intrinsic conflict between science and religion. And we also want to argue in the rest of this session that religion is an important missing dimension for gender and racial diversity in science, especially given the higher religiosity of women and racial minorities in general. And then finally, we need to better understand the varieties of atheism in science. And in addition, it is important, we want to argue, to develop better ways for scientists and religious communities to work together. So I'm going to stop my summary of the presentation there. and I will cede the floor here. Thank you.
Thank you, Brandon. Hi, everybody. My name is Dave Johnson, and I'm a sociologist of higher education at the University of Nevada in Reno. And I also worked as a postdoc on the religion among scientists in international context study. The premise of my talk was that many religious people believe that most scientists are atheists, and they believe that all atheist scientists are anti-religious, like Richard Dawkins and other vocal new atheists, whose rhetoric is popular among atheists, but potentially alienating to the religious community in the United States, which includes groups that are actively being or attempting to be recruited to the science and engineering workforce, such as women and racial minorities. And we know what religious people think about atheist scientists from other work that our team has collectively done. What we wanted to do in this project is whether the rhetoric of atheism that we hear in the public sphere amongst the most vocal new atheists is actually aligned with the reality of atheism among day-to-day scientists. And so to investigate this, we draw on a subset of the data from the Religion Among Scientists in International Context study that focuses on about 1,200 atheist scientists in the United States and the United Kingdom. And then we also explored in-depth interviews with a subset of 81 atheist scientists across these two regions. And overall, as I explained in the talk, what we show is that religious or atheist scientists are actually much more demographically diverse than we typically think. And most importantly, they're quite diverse in what they think about religion. With respect to demographic diversity, for example, we show that nearly 1/3 of atheist scientists are women, nearly 1/3 come from racial minorities. They span across all career stages, and they tend to be more likely to come from biology than physics. But what I want to drill down on for just a moment here is how they're diverse in terms of what they think about religion. And to get at this, we looked specifically at a variety of survey questions in the interviews to try and identify different types of varieties of atheism in science. And we talk about three. One category, which represents about 2/3 of atheist scientists, are what we call modernist atheists. These are the scientists who are atheists. They're convinced there's no God. They have absolutely no participation in any type of religious organization, and they rarely interact with religious individuals. To be sure, some modernist atheists are indeed like Dawkins and Sam Harris in that they're fierce critics of religion. But what we find overwhelmingly is that most modernist atheists either are indifferent to religion, they don't think about it, or they think that under many circumstances it has a positive role to play in society. And what we find across nearly all of the modernist atheists in our sample, which represent about 2/3 of the atheist scientists in the United States, is that they're very concerned about the derisive rhetoric that vocal new atheists espouse in the public sphere, and they believe that it's damaging to public confidence in science and recruiting minorities to science. So that's the first category. The second category we call spiritual atheists, and they represent about 6% of the atheist scientists in the United States. They don't believe in God, but they do identify as spiritual. And what we found in interviews with these scientists is that they see their work, whether it's exploring the cosmos or biology, as spiritual in some way. So they don't embrace sacred beliefs, but they do create secular forms of spirituality of varying types. And then the final category, which represents about 1/5 of atheist scientists in the United States, we call culturally religious atheists. And these are atheist scientists who, despite their irreligion, are connected to religion in a variety of ways. Some of them are married to religious spouses. Some of them send their kids to religious schools. Some of them identify with a religious tradition and even attend services from time to time, but don't believe in God. And so this category is the most unlike the new atheists. And overall, when you examine the survey data on the attitudes that atheist scientists have towards the relationship between science and religion, we find that only half of US atheist scientists actually think that there's a conflict between science and religion. That proportion goes up a little bit when you look specifically at the modernist atheists, and it goes down when you look at spiritual atheists and culturally religious atheists. And so in sum, what we argue in this talk and in a book that's coming out next year is that the rhetoric of new atheism that we see in the public sphere is not aligned with the reality of atheism and science. And we think that the derisive rhetoric that one sees from new atheists in the public sphere is damaging to public confidence in science. And accordingly, we encourage dialogue between and science communication between the scientific community and religious communities in the United States. Thank you for participating in our session. And with that, I turn it over to my colleague, Elaine Eck.
Hello, hello. My name is Elaine Howard Eklund, and I'm the Herbert S. Autry Chair in Social Sciences and Director of the Religion and Public Life program at Rice University. My talk was specifically about the US context, and I used our data to argue that in the US, a thoughtful approach to religion within the scientific community may be part of increasing gender and racial diversity in science. I'm going to make 4 big summary points summarizing what I said in the talk. First, the US scientific workforce is not racially or gender diverse. I probably don't need to convince many of our listeners of this, but from our own data of biologists and physicists who work at US research universities, we see that women account for roughly 39% of biologists and 17% of physicists in our sample. It's important to note that these numbers pool junior and senior scholars, and the disparity is much worse when we enter the higher ranks of faculty positions at research universities. And when we look at the proportion of Black and Hispanic individuals in science, the numbers appear even more stark. We see that 2% of biologists are Black and less than 1% of physicists. About 5% of our biologists from our sample are Hispanic, and 2% of our physicists are Hispanic. But most important for our concerns here in the title of the talk, Black and Hispanic Americans and women of all racial groups are particularly likely to be religious and are more likely to be religious than white men. A second point, Christian women in particular may be self-selecting out of science because of concerns about parenting and the scientific career. One potential reason we have found one potential way that religion may matter for the underrepresentation of women in science is that Christian women in particular may be self-selecting out of science. A piece of this puzzle may be parenting. Religious women, we know from broader data, are more likely to have children, and Christian women in particular may be particularly likely to perceive that high-level research science careers are not friendly to parenting. We do see among the scientists we studied that 39% of religious women scientists who have children, compared with 55% of men scientists who are religious. So university scientists who are Christian women also say that they are especially likely to perceive religious discrimination. Third, things are a little bit different when we turn to racial demographics of science. Black and Hispanic scientists are not appreciably less religious than the general population of these groups. When we turn to look at race and religion together among scientists, something different emerges than when looking at gender. We see that just looking at Black Americans broadly, 79% are affiliated with a Christian tradition. The proportion, though, is quite high for Black US scientists as well, where 64% of Black scientists are affiliated with a Christian tradition, and 15% are part of another religion. Notably as well, Black scientists also say that they're particularly likely to perceive religious discrimination. Fourth, we want to make a point about scientific outreach, that is namely this: scientific and religious communities could work together for the sake of diversity in science. One possibility is that religious communities need to be more careful of all of the implicit ways they discourage women from careers in general, but particularly may discourage women from pursuing science. And from what we are finding, if scientific communities reflect on the ways they might foster family-friendly work environments, that may, by implication, encourage more religious women to enter science and increase the gender diversity in science overall. And we might need to start thinking about what it would look like for scientists to do outreach to youth through Black and Hispanic religious communities, particularly Black and Hispanic scientists who are themselves persons of faith. Often in the scientific community, we have broadly framed religion as a problem for science, and there is a reality there. But especially in Black and Hispanic communities and among women, religious organizations and scientific organizations might just work together to increase diversity in the scientific workforce. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you all for your presentations. So now we're going to give each of the panel respondents 2 minutes to summarize their responses. And I'll turn it first to Moramai Lopez Alonso, and then follow that with Say Kim, and then Georgia Dunstan.
Hello, my name is Moramai Lopez Alonso, and I was a respondent for Brandon Baidayan Nayat presentation. And in response to his presentation, my main point was that it's important to, when looking at a global perspective of perceptions of scientists and religiosity, it's important to look at history and the importance of history in defining the relationship between the government, science, and religiosity. If normally governments that have been more open to freedom of religion or that have favored religiosity tend to be, interact differently than those countries where there has been religious persecution or that have been completely anti-religious. So that is something that would give us a sense of why certain countries behave in which way, and also if there are different competing religions within the country, because that could also play a role of how scientists perceive religion. And also it is important to think, as the studies expands, thinking of these different interactions of how things would look like in places like Latin America or Africa, where the role of secularization, or when secularization came, could affect the way that the role that scientists feel about religion, and if it's part of their research, or if it's something that is that exists in two different dimensions of their lives. Thank you.
I guess I'll start. Again, my name is Say Kim. Good to join you this afternoon. Currently I'm serving as Director of Membership and Governance at the National Academy of Medicine. I want to start off by saying thank you to Drs. Eklund, Vayananthan, and Johnson for an insightful panel on this opportunity to provide comments. I thought a little bit about what I can speak on, and I believe I can touch on engagement, as many of the speakers have touched upon as well. My career really has been in areas of engagement and discourse, from public engagement to member engagement. The social research the three scientists presented is important for two reasons, I think. First is that their studies and numbers gives data to how our world is perceived and lived, particularly when it comes to science, scientists, religion, and religious audiences and communities. And so it gives data to uncover some misconceptions as well. For example, that there's always a conflict felt in science, which is not true, and uncover some important discoveries that religious, for example, religious and non-religious alike, have interest in science, and that when looking at race and gender demographics, Blacks, Hispanics, and women are underrepresented in science and tend to be more religious. The second reason I think their research is so important is that the question of now what? How do we use the data, similar to giving a name to an issue, to spur engagement in things like equity and inclusion in STEM and public trust in science? Much of the country, as you know, is tackling issues about equity and inclusion and public trust in science, because I believe there's an ongoing change. There's a change in the culture of science practice, and there's a change in culture of country in its opinion of science. So let me explain. Scientists, at least when I studied science, and maybe still, are taught not to bring anything other than science into the lab. Science plus anything was not allowed. So when it came to recognizing aspects of religion, their own lives, it was not part of the game. But I believe this is changing. science and scientists are recognizing that in order for science to be effective and for the common good, that the dimensions of a whole person, like their religious practices, hobbies, and so forth, and hence the members of the society as a whole, needs to be recognized in both doing the science and communicating the science effectively. This panel is an example of that, so as well as the AAAS Dozer program, which I was a part of for many years. Perhaps the idea is most apparent now when many of us are working from home and kids are home, and we have to recognize that there's a significant impact on careers for many scientists, mostly women, who are young parents. Second, the change in science has been probably spurred by the recognition that there's a change in the public sphere. Studies show that there's a growing distrust of science, as many speakers have mentioned, which may be partly due to religion and other affiliations. Nonetheless, this calls for scientists to recognize that we have to communicate and engage more with communities and find ways to build that trust. One way to do this is to recognize engagement not in terms of abstract science topics, but to engage on local and personal issues like career paths or health implications. A current issue I just want to highlight is that we see in COVID response, for example. We know that underrepresented minorities, particularly Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and other peoples of color, are disproportionately affected by COVID. And alarmingly, Black Americans are 1.5 times more likely to have died, and polls indicate that Black Americans are far less likely than other groups to intend to get vaccinated. When we recognize that gender and race play an important role in the practice, application of and engagement of science, including religion, or recognition of religious perspectives, it will strengthen the efforts of science for the common good. Thank you.
Georgia, I want to unmute.
I'm Georgia Dunston, Professor Emerita from Howard University. And I want to thank especially Dr. Eklund for this opportunity this evening to respond to her very interesting and provocative presentation on thinking about religion as a cultural variable, how this can increase racial and gender diversity in science. The data presented are very clear that it's interesting that while a majority of the general US public self-identify with a religious affiliation, which is predominantly Christian in the US, scientists, however, in the US are less likely to be religious than the general public. That this difference is particularly evident when we look at racial diversity. It was noted in the data that the majority, 60% of white non-Hispanic US scientists identified as no religion. And this was true also for the Hispanic and other groups looked at here. However, in stark contrast, only 21% of Black scientists were identified as non-religious. And among the white non-Hispanic group, Christians were represented relatively equally among Catholics and Protestants, while in the Black group, Protestants were 64% of the group were identified compared to 20% Catholics. It was noted that in the Hispanic group, the percentage of Catholics was higher, whereas in the non-Hispanic white group, Catholics and Protestants were equally distributed. It's also interesting that when we look at gender diversity, where in the general population, the percentage of men and women are about the same, but when we look at the U.S. scientist group, men significantly are dominant compared to the percentage of women, almost 2 to 1. And this difference was was seen also between the general public, the scientist group, whereas in the general public, there was no real difference between men and women in the religious group, and no difference between men and women in the non-religious group. Whereas in scientists, the 2 to 1 difference that we see of men over women also was true with the religious 2 to 1 and the non-religious group 2 to 1. Now, considering the theme of this AAAS annual meeting this year on dynamic ecosystems, and with religion as a major cultural variable in the US academic ecosystem, along with racial and gender dynamics, I would like to ask Dr. Eklund to comment, if she would, on if and how the ecosystem of the research university in the US might itself be a factor influencing the data presented in her very interesting findings in this session. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you for those engaging responses, everyone. So I think now all the panelists and respondents can show their videos and unmute their microphones. And we have a couple of questions from the audience if we wanted to start there, or if the panelists had some responses to the respondent questions, we could start there. Where do you all want to begin, do you think?
I'll go ahead and take Professor Dunstan's last question, and then we can maybe perhaps Brandon and David, if you wanted to say something, and then we can jump right into the, I see there's quite a few comments in our Slido, if I'm saying that correctly. So this is a great comment regarding how, if I understand correctly, how the research university ecosystem has an impact on the very nature of data collection. And I think it certainly does in terms of how we think about universities and prestige levels of universities, and how we even conceptualize what it means to be a prestigious university. Some universities that are kept out have had an enormous impact on the careers of Black and Hispanic scientists. I mean, I think about a university like your own, like Howard, that has had an enormous impact in encouraging Black students to go into science. I mean, there's excellent programs at Howard and other HBCUs. And so the way that we even classify what counts as a research university and what top research universities are is very much stratified. And so I think we need to think about that and include more conscious study of that going forward. So that's a quick response to that, to what deserves a longer response, but for time I'll cut off there, and maybe you and I can talk more offline about that as well.
One thing I would add to that comment on the ecosystem, just to dovetail what Elaine was pointing out, is if part of the concern is that the religious public thinks of colleges and universities as hostile to religious belief, and if the view is that that's especially predominant at research universities, we should keep in mind that 45% of students enrolled in institutions of higher learning are at community colleges, where these types of dynamics, which actually overrepresent students of underrepresented backgrounds, and where a lot of these dynamics just are not obvious. So I just wanted to add that a major chunk of students who attend college do so outside of the types of contexts that we studied.
I could quickly respond to Dr. Lopez Alonso's question. I think she raises a really important point about the varieties of secularism around the world and how that affects the science-religion relationship. So I think in contexts like Latin America and Africa, I mean, there are a couple of factors that are quite important to consider. One would be the impact of colonialism on science education and scientific education, right? So you might think of how missionaries around the world encouraged or emphasized scientific education and training to varying degrees. And so the extent to which that imprint or that impact is stronger, we would expect to see some differences compared to contexts where that was not emphasized. And the other factor is the political relationship between church and state, right? So in our case of Italy, for instance, a lot of the tension that we found among Italian scientists was not around the issue of belief in God or that aspect of religion, but in the political dimension of the church-state interaction, and they found the church encroaching on the realm of science through political interventions in ways that they thought were unacceptable. So that's another realm of conflict distinct from what we're talking about.
There's a lot of questions. Should we just go right down through them, Jackie?
Yeah, I was thinking that David Ornstein's question and Rob's question were kind of the same. So if we could kind of put those together in terms of how do you define being religious in your study, and to what extent is the concept of religion consistent across the cultures you studied? And if not, how should that inform the interpretation of your results?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Yeah, so we have, I mean, this as sociologists, we have a variety of measures of religion and religiosity. And so the one we presented in my first slide was self-perception of do you consider yourself a religious person or not? That's one measure, but then we have measures of religious affiliation. Do you belong to a religious tradition? If so, which one? And then attendance in religious services, apart from weddings and funerals, prayer and meditation, the extent to which you consider yourself a spiritual person. So are you religious and spiritual, religious but not spiritual, spiritual but not religious, so that kind of thing. The belief in God, and again, a variety of ways in which we ask that question, beliefs in higher power. So quite a range. And so depending on how we analyze those variables, we can get some interesting differences across different countries.
We also asked scientists that we sat down with for interviews to define what religion means to them and how they understand spirituality and the distinction between those two. But in terms of categorizing people, we primarily rely on the survey data.
Okay, so moving on, Christina did end up emailing me her sort of comment on the high rates of religiosity in Hong Kong and Taiwan, and I thought I'd read that out and see if you all had any responses to that. So Christina says, as a Chinese American, I do not find the result of the high number of religious scientists in Hong Kong and Taiwan surprising. Science as we know it today is the result of Western education. Western education in China was very intertwined with the Western Protestant missionaries until the 1940s. This Western education also included Western medicine as being part of science. When China closed, those who had Western education and those who were religious fled to Hong Kong and Taiwan, i.e. selective migration. So the intermingling of science and religion has continued to the descendants of those who originally left China.
Well,
So,
Christina, be in touch with us if you want to write articles from these data with us. This is
Yeah, we get this question every time. So if you could just show up and explain that every time we're asked why the rates are higher, that would be helpful.
So that is what is fun about doing research with scientists themselves. So our research subjects obviously are scientists rather than atoms or other kinds of things that scientists study. Is that scientists have really clever ways of understanding and explaining the data. And so it was fun when we interviewed scientists in those national contexts, they said something that was very similar to what you said. So they sometimes, were able to comment on the history of those nations and how that has an impact on current religiosity. So great comment.
Just wanted to highlight that I know, Elaine has done studies on civic for Asian American immigrants, and as one of such, I'm kind of curious that the population of Asian American scientists, if their religiosity is higher than across the board because of the impact of immigration and religious practice. So it's an interesting point in the US as well.
So they are not more religious, at least in US research science careers. And we wonder, we don't have an oversample. So I should say we don't have an oversample of Asian Americans, but from what little data we have, they are not more religious when compared to Asian Americans more broadly in the US, in the same way that they aren't comparably religious, they're less religious, whereas Hispanic and Black scientists tend to be similarly religious, a little bit less religious, but similarly religious. But it's a good point, and I would make a strong distinction between Asian internationals and Asian Americans. And if we'd been able to give the longer version of the talk, in the talk we said that the difference in the representation of Asians in science when compared to Blacks and Hispanics is in part due to the heavy presence of Asian internationals that serve as sending countries for the scientific workforce at research universities in the US.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
The next question is from an anonymous participant who asks, with findings that women and persons from groups underrepresented in science identify as more religious, how can universities be welcoming to people of faith?
So one quick thing I would say is don't even think about being welcoming as a first line, just don't be discouraging or disparaging, if that makes sense. So sometimes it's a matter of offhanded negative comments that make people, and we see this kind of thing, of course, with studies of racism and sexism, what we call microaggressions. People make offhanded comments, they do small things that make people feel unwelcome. And so if we could get rid of that, I think that's a first step. And then we can talk about other more deeper things. And then something that our group is very interested in is actually teaching scientists and others how to do outreach into faith communities. So many Black and Hispanic faith communities hold, say, after school programs and childcare programs. And what if those sites, those organizations were then places where scientific outreach could occur, is maybe also another positive way of looking at things.
The other thing that I would add to that, just as somebody who formally studies institutions of higher learning, is that obviously there's a lot of discourse about diversity, equity, and inclusion on college campuses. And diversity is discussed in multiple ways, but almost never in connection to religion, as writers like Ibu Patel have pointed out for a long time. And so there's like administrative units that focus on specific groups, but there are also religious organizations often at the edges of campus, but not much interaction between those two. And so that would be another basis for a dialogue and collaboration that universities might consider. What exactly do we mean when we mean diversity, equity, and inclusive? Who are we not talking about, and what are the existing arrangements that we can take advantage of to expand and widen that discussion?
Great. So the next question comes from a respondent named Camille Cooley. She asks, what is the role of cultural competency here? Also, what are the known methods of incorporating students' cultural capital into STEM education?
I think we're just starting to really talk about that. Say, and David, you might be also equipped to talk about this given the kind of work that you do. But I think Say made a really good point that for decades, scientists were taught very strongly not to bring their whole selves to work, that this is actually something that is actively discouraged. And so, along with that came an implicit notion that one shouldn't talk about being a parent. And I've interviewed women scientists who are older who said that they actually felt like they had to actively deny talking about being a parent when they went up for tenure at their universities. And so bringing an understanding of religion into the workplace and making scientific workplaces more welcoming to religion, I think is very much part of making scientific workplaces more friendly to the whole person in work, which in the end, I would argue, and I think there's some good social science research to back this up, that honoring diversity of people actually can lead to better science because of the kind of backgrounds and competencies that people bring to bear, and especially better scientific outreach. Maybe others have something to add.
Because I think would expand to applied sciences as well, right? I mean, if we think of something like medicine or mental health, I mean, that's another area where religious and spiritual competency is especially important, and only recently are fields like clinical psychology and social work really trying to take this seriously and recognize, interfacing, right, with clients who have spiritual or religious backgrounds, and how important that is for even things like compliance with taking medications, right? So I think scientific training needs to better engage with learning more about faith communities and how that interface could, again, for our purposes, how do we think of addressing some of the issues here, that any biases against science that exist in religious communities, for instance, requires that dialogue and that kind of competency.
A participant named Allison asked, why were physics and biology the two fields chosen? Do the panelists think fields with greater gender or racial diversity would have more religious individuals?
So we chose biology and physics because when you're doing an 8-country study, when you're surveying 22,000 scientists, you have to cut it off somewhere. That's the really practical practical answer. And biology and physics are core disciplines that are have a significant presence in each of the 8 national and regional contexts we studied. That said, it's not to downplay the significance of other disciplines, and there would be great benefit in expanding this study to include other disciplines. These are also 2 disciplines which have a very long history in the academy. They're disciplines which historically and presently have had a different relationship to religion. They have different proportions of women, and they are disciplines which are kind of different in these different national contexts, even as they are present in the national context. So we have a pretty elaborate way of thinking about these cases, but the questioner is right that there would be huge benefit to looking at other disciplines as well.
I think we have time for maybe one more question, and I'll pose the question from Adria Brooks, who asked, have you seen trends among religions/spiritualities in science? For example, are some religions more common among scientists, and why might that be?
I would say some religions are more common among scientists in some national contexts is the way that we might understand that across national contexts. Certainly in the US, Christianity is more common among scientists because that's also our modal religious tradition in the US, although there are significant, as we've discussed previously, a significant number of non-religious scientists. So just looking at the level of cross-national variation and then religious traditions that are present within each national context. Secondly, the questioner, I think, might be getting at deeper issues of theologies and ways of viewing religion. So religious traditions which tend to be less, say, receptive to change when met with science as a belief system, are also a bit less present, at least in research universities of the type that we studied. I think in other kinds of, Brandon and David both have mentioned, in other kinds of institutions and in other kinds of atmospheres and organizations for doing science, like research and development and corporations, I think the religiosity of scientists does change a bit when compared to university life. And we have some articles on those topics too, if people are interested, and you can look at our website.
All right, well, we only have about 1 minute left, so I think we're going to have to wrap it up there. But I wanted to sort of end by thanking all the panelists and the respondents for a great discussion today, and especially to those of you for watching, taking the time to engage with this work and asking really engaging questions. If you're interested in learning more about the project, you can pick up the book that this work is based on, called Secularity in Science: What Scientists Around the World Really Think About Religion, from Oxford University Press. So thanks again, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day and a great rest of the conference.